At the dawn of the 20th century, humanity was feeling pretty good about itself. Electricity was lighting up cities, engines were shrinking, and inventors everywhere were confidently announcing that the future had officially arrived. Naturally, this led to one very reasonable conclusion. It was time to start hiding boats underwater. Submarines, at this point, were less silent hunter of the deep and more ambitious metal tube held together by optimism. They were experimental, controversial, and widely considered a terrible idea by people who enjoyed breathing without effort. Critics warned that staying underwater for extended periods would scramble the human brain, collapse lungs, or at the very least make everyone deeply regret their career choices. And then came a small submarine with a big name and even bigger confidence. Built to prove that underwater navigation was not only possible but practical, this vessel was designed to sit beneath the waves calmly, quietly, and indefinitely, or at least long enough to make skeptics uncomfortable. It had electric propulsion, sealed compartments, and an almost smug belief in its own engineering. The idea was simple: demonstrate reliability, impress the Navy, and usher in a bold new era of naval warfare. For a while, it worked. The submarine performed beautifully. It stayed submerged far longer than anyone expected. The crew emerged unharmed, relaxed, and irritatingly alive. Newspapers celebrated. Doubters adjusted their glasses. Engineers nodded like people who had definitely planned this all along. Which makes what happened next deeply impressive in the worst possible way. Because after surviving storms, skeptics, and the basic concept of physics, this warship would meet its end not in battle, not in deep water, and not because of a mechanical failure. It would sink because of something far simpler. Something human. So how did a vessel designed to conquer the ocean lose a fight with its own front door? To understand why this whole thing felt like such a triumph at the time, you have to zoom out a bit and step into the mindset of the early 1900s. Navies around the world were locked in a familiar pattern. Bigger ships, thicker armor, larger guns. Progress, as everyone agreed, meant adding more steel and more firepower until the ocean itself politely moved aside. Submarines didn't fit that logic at all. They were quiet, cramped, and deeply unsettling to traditional naval officers. No flags flying, no visible power, just a machine that disappeared beneath the surface and reappeared when it felt like it. To some, this was innovation. To others, it was borderline cheating. And to many doctors and scientists of the era, it was a floating medical experiment waiting to end badly. This particular submarine was built right in the middle of that debate. Its creators weren't trying to be reckless. They were trying to be convincing. Every test dive was a performance. Every successful hour underwater a rebuttal to critics who insisted crews would panic, suffocate, or go slightly mad after a few hours below the surface. And when the submarine pulled off a record-setting submerged endurance test in calm confidence, it felt like a turning point. Proof, at last, that humans could operate beneath the waves without everything immediately going wrong. If you enjoy stories where history looks completely reasonable right up until it doesn't, feel free to leave a comment. And if this already feels like one of those "this should have been obvious" moments, liking the video and subscribing helps more than you'd think. Because now that the idea had been proven, attention shifted to something far less glamorous. Routine operations. And that's usually where history starts sharpening its sense of humor. There's something especially dangerous about success when it arrives early and without consequences. It creates a quiet confidence, the kind that settles into routines and checklists and unspoken assumptions. Once a machine proves it can survive storms, pressure, and skeptical experts, it starts to feel solved. Not perfect, maybe, but trustworthy. Familiar. Safe. And that's when attention drifts. On paper, this submarine was a showcase of modern thinking. Electric motors hummed instead of roared. Air systems were carefully calculated. Every compartment had a purpose, every valve a reason. It was the sort of design that made engineers proud and made traditionalists nervous. A vessel meant to demonstrate that humans could outthink the ocean by planning carefully enough. But beneath all that engineering confidence sat an unglamorous truth. No matter how advanced the machine, it still depended on people doing small, boring things correctly every single time. No headlines are written about hatches that are properly secured. No medals are awarded for double-checking a seal. Those actions don't feel heroic. They feel routine. And routines, once they become familiar, have a way of fading into the background. The irony is that nothing about the coming mistake involved danger, urgency, or chaos. There was no enemy, no storm, no desperate maneuver, just a calm workday, a controlled environment, and a decision that seemed harmless enough in the moment. A submarine that had already proven it could survive the sea itself was about to discover a much more dangerous force. Casual confidence. Because when technology works a little too well, it invites the most timeless error in human history, assuming that nothing will go wrong, just this once. By the time this submarine began attracting serious attention, the argument had shifted. The question was no longer whether a crew could survive underwater, but whether this strange new machine deserved a place in modern navies. And to answer that, it had to behave less like an experiment and more like a reliable tool. That meant demonstrations. Lots of them. During one particularly bold test, the submarine slipped beneath the surface and stayed there for an astonishing stretch of time. While surface ships nearby were being tossed around by heavy weather, the crew sat quietly below, protected by a few inches of steel and an enormous amount of confidence in their seals. They waited. They monitored. They breathed normally. And when they finally resurfaced, they looked less like survivors and more like people mildly annoyed that the experiment was over. The press loved it. Scientists grudgingly revised their assumptions. Naval officers took notes while pretending not to be impressed. The submarine had done exactly what it was built to do. It made the impossible look routine. And that was the problem. Once something extraordinary becomes routine, it stops feeling fragile. The machinery becomes familiar. Procedures feel optional rather than essential. The submarine wasn't being pushed to its limits anymore. It was being handled, adjusted, and maintained like any other vessel. Work around it became casual. Movements were efficient. Decisions were made quickly, without ceremony. The danger wasn't ignored. It was simply no longer loud enough to demand attention. This is how accidents often begin in history. Not with panic or incompetence, but with confidence earned honestly, and then trusted just a little too much. The submarine had proven it could survive the sea. It had not yet proven it could survive human routine. The day everything went wrong did not feel important while it was happening. There was no ceremony, no audience, no sense that anyone should be paying extra attention. The submarine was tied up at the company's wharf, undergoing ordinary adjustments. The kind of work that happens when a machine is no longer exciting, just familiar. At some point, a decision was made to lower part of the vessel into the water. Not a full dive. Nothing dramatic. Just enough submersion to make access to certain components easier. It was the nautical equivalent of lifting one side of a car to change a tire. And this is where history leans in. Submarines, as it turns out, are deeply unforgiving of assumptions. Every hatch, every seal, every closure exists for a reason. Miss one, and the ocean doesn't negotiate. It doesn't pause to clarify intentions. It simply shows up. One hatch, the forward one, was not secured. No alarm screamed. No immediate chaos followed. Water began entering calmly, confidently, as water tends to do. The submarine, designed to balance itself with precision, did exactly what physics told it to do. It lost buoyancy. It settled. And within moments, the proud prototype was resting on the bottom, directly beneath the dock where it had been built to impress the world. 15 feet of water. Not the open sea. Not combat. Not even a test. Just enough depth to make the situation humiliating rather than heroic. Attempts to raise the vessel that night went nowhere. By morning, the reality had set in. A machine engineered to challenge the limits of underwater endurance had been defeated by a forgotten step in a routine process. There were no casualties. Just silence, soaked equipment, and a realization no one wanted to put in writing. Somewhere between innovation and habit, someone had trusted the system to take care of itself. The ocean, as always, disagreed. Once the submarine was finally raised, the damage turned out to be almost disappointingly ordinary. No dramatic rupture. No catastrophic failure of the hull. Just the slow, invasive consequences of salt water finding places it was never meant to be. Electrical systems suffered. Internal components aged several years overnight. The vessel still existed, but its moment had quietly passed. Publicly, the incident was handled with care. Embarrassment has a way of encouraging discretion, especially when governments and military contracts are involved. The story didn't vanish, but it softened at the edges. An unfortunate mishap, a minor setback, certainly nothing that should derail the grand future of undersea warfare. Privately, the damage was already done. Trust is a fragile thing in procurement, and prototypes live or die by confidence. This submarine had proven it could survive long hours underwater, bad weather, and skeptical experts. What it could not survive was the impression that it had been undone by something avoidable. The machine was no longer a promise. It was a reminder. Interest faded. Attention shifted elsewhere. New designs appeared, all claiming to have learned the right lessons from earlier efforts. The submarine was eventually sold off, refitted, and sent far from the dock where its reputation had quietly sunk. Ironically, once removed from the spotlight that had exposed its weakness, it performed competently. It served. It operated. It did the job it had always been meant to do, just not under the flag it was built to impress. By then, its original failure had already joined a familiar category in human history. Not a tragedy of ambition, but a footnote of routine. A moment when no one expected anything to go wrong, and so no one was fully watching. The kind of mistake that rarely makes sense in hindsight, and almost always feels obvious once it does. What makes this story linger isn't the scale of the mistake, but its size. No grand miscalculation, no flawed theory, no reckless gamble. Just a sequence of reasonable actions carried out by competent people who trusted that the system around them would behave the way it always had. And most of the time, it did. The submarine wasn't defeated by the ocean's depth, by enemy fire, or by the limits of early technology. It was undone by familiarity, by the quiet confidence that settles in after repeated success, by the assumption that one small step, left unchecked, couldn't possibly matter. History is full of moments like this. Complex systems that fail not because they are weak, but because they are strong enough to make people comfortable. Innovations that survive extraordinary stress, only to stumble during ordinary routines. The more impressive the machine, the easier it becomes to forget how many small, unremarkable actions are holding it together. There's something oddly reassuring about that. It reminds us that history doesn't always turn on villains or geniuses or dramatic turning points. Sometimes it turns on a latch, a checklist, a door someone was sure they had already closed. The submarine followed its incentives. The people around it followed theirs. And the outcome wasn't explosive or spectacular, just quietly inevitable, which might be the most unsettling part of all.